Let's get started with the Writer Center, the virtual craft chat, which is where we talk to authors a little bit less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. We're here tonight with legendary Marita Golden, who's going to start us. I'm so glad you're here. Deeply honored that you brought this book to us. I'll ask you to start by reading a few pages from How to Become a Black Writer.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. I've been a supporter of the Writers Center because I live in the DMV, live in Bowie, Maryland. So I'm familiar with the Writers Center and all the work you do. And I've actually taught at the Writers Center, and you have a great group of people that come out for the classes. So I'm really glad to be doing this. I'm going to be reading a short section, just a couple of pages, that deals with how I ended up writing my very first book, Migrations of the Heart. I had really thought my first book would be a novel. To my surprise, it was a memoir that I began writing at the age of 28. And so I'd been living in Nigeria with my first husband. So that's sort of the backstory. One summer when I made what had become an annual trip back to the States to visit family and friends, I met with Marcia Gillespie, the editor of Essence, and told her that I was ready to show the novel to an agent. She recommended I contact Carol Mann, who had just opened a literary agency on Manhattan's East Side. I had no idea the day I walked up the winding stairs to Carol's tiny office that we would become friends and that she would be my agent for the next 40 years and remain so. I'd sent Carol the manuscript of the novel, and we met to discuss her thoughts about the book. She was brown-haired with an open, eager gaze. We talked for a while about her company, and then she told me that she was impressed with my writing, but not so certain about the novel. Then she quickly inquired almost breathlessly, "So tell me about your life in Nigeria." Carol folded her hands on her desk and shifted slightly as though to get more comfortable in her chair. No one, not family, members, or friends, had ever asked me that question with the optimistic expectation I heard in Carol's voice. When I talked with friends about living in a country where my Blackness was the norm and how I no longer felt the literal and figurative burden of racism, I saw in their faces partial acceptance of my words. Yet I knew that friends and family had read and had seen accounts of coups and the stories of famine and poverty on the continent. I knew that more than a few of my family members thought I'd lost my mind, choosing to live in what some of them saw, I knew, as the heart of darkness. My feelings about living in Nigeria were complex. I loved the sight of the women of Nigeria, whose skin color and body shape echoed my own. There was a palpable sense that living on the African continent, in one of the continent's most influential nations, my life and its meaning were highly charged. I constructed and held to an identity wedded to Africa and Africans. Corruption was rampant in Nigeria, as was tribalism. But wasn't American racism corrupt? Didn't American capitalism turn the American dream into a nightmare for many? Wasn't the progress African Americans made, whether political, social, or economic, perennially met with white backlash? I wanted my son to grow up in an environment where he could feel the intense pride in who he was that his father felt, not threatened by racial profiling or self-doubt because of the color of his skin. Carol was an agent. Her job was to look for great stories, to find them, encourage writers to tell them. She was not convinced that at that moment my novel was the great story I had to tell. So I told her about my life in Nigeria, living as a highly educated feminist in a deeply patriarchal society that still circumcised female babies, where there was no concept of a single woman, as a woman's value was entirely related to marriage and motherhood. One of my husband's family, his father who'd had 12 wives, and that some of my husband's family members practiced polygamy. Of my journalism students who were smart and ambitious and hungered to improve their country and to visit America. Of the tremendous creative and intellectual energy I witnessed in so many Nigerians, from women selling meat in the market to boys hawking fruit on the side of the road, to my colleagues at the university, and the twixt and tween lives of Black women married to Nigerians who struggled to honor themselves and who they were, as well as the culture they were now part of. Many of us were feminists, and we had shared with one another our fears of raising girl children in our adopted home. When I finished telling Carol about my life, I felt as though I'd met myself for the first time. "Why aren't you writing about that?" she asked gently. I'd been so busy living that dramatic, conflict-filled, compelling story that I had never assessed it. It was mine to live, not mine to dissect and reimagine, which is what writing requires. "I want to write the novel, not about my life," I told her with a slightly defensive insistence. "All right," she said, "but that's the story you should write. Please, let's stay in touch." I left her office elated and confused. Carol thought I was a good writer, and she wanted to stay in touch with me, but she wanted me to write a story that, finding myself on the sweltering sidewalk outside of her building, I had no idea how to compose and did not want to construct. I'd have to confront the increasing fissures in my marriage, the emotional incompatibility with Femi, the nagging cultural differences I could no longer ignore, and how, as that marriage was spiraling toward dissolution, no one in his family would or could understand my growing anguish and the fear that if I walked away from our union, I would lose my son. When I returned to Nigeria, I knew my life there was over. Slowly, day by day, I dreamed of a new existence. I saw my experience as Carol Mann had, realizing that my life contained the elements of a compelling narrative. At the age of 24, I followed my heart and my hopes to another country, became part of a polygamous African family, and a university professor and mother, while grappling with the pressures of cultural differences and the weight of my unaddressed grief around the death of my parents. To the people around me, I was the same woman as before. What was invisible to their eyes was how I've been transformed. Now I was possessed by the lure of writing a complex, dimensional narrative, a narrative about me. I'd feel this possession many times in the years to come. It's a feeling at once sublime and utterly peaceful. Its hold feels like both a grip and an embrace. Possessed, I've been given a creative mission that feels imperative and that I don't fully understand yet don't question. Ironically, I had wanted to write a story that only I could imagine. I thought that story would be a novel. Instead, it was a memoir. Only in the writing of Migrations of the Heart did I realize how much of our lives we imagine and how much of our lives rival the most satisfying fiction. As I was strategizing how to leave my marriage and how to write about it, I became a researcher, interviewing Femi's family members for details of Yoruba culture and life that I would need for the book. Any information about Nigeria, the country, and its people that in my 4 years there I'd taken for granted or overlooked, I now revisited with new, more observant eyes. I looked at faces closely, assessed personal interactions between people everywhere, and turned my brother-in-law into an anthropologist who educated me about the customs and beliefs of the family I'd become part of and was now planning to leave. I was a vulture circling over the impending ruins of my life, a vulture riddled with sorrow, guilt, and regret. Writing would turn an experience that threatened to live in my memory only as ash into material that could resurrect and redefine love, hope, optimism, and joy. All the emotions I'd initially felt when Femi and I met, and that despite the dark days had been real. I'd written poetry and journalism that I was proud of and completed a draft of a novel that I'd been told didn't quite make the grade. I knew what a well-crafted book could do. Powerful, beautiful stories had given me life all my life. That's what I swore I would do for myself and my readers.
Thank you. I'm gonna actually skip over the traditional first question for craft chats, which is, who the heck are you? Because I think you've just answered that. I'd love to let's start by talking genres, because this is so Kevin Powell describes this book as part memoir, part history, part meditation on race, gender, and identity, and that's just a partial quote. So in terms of genre, how would you describe this book?
Well, I'd actually describe it as a memoir that ends up being a how-to book. So that it was inspired by the fact that at the end of 2024, of 2023, I was honored with a program that a number of my writer friends here put on for me. It was declared Marita Golden Day in Washington, D.C. and in Prince George's County. And it was really a beautiful program where I literally got my flowers, and writers who'd known me for a very long time, former students, came out to celebrate me. And so after that, I began thinking that of all the memoirs I'd written, and I've written several, I'd never really written specifically about how I became a writer. And so when I sat down to write, I wanted to do a couple of things. I wanted to write about, yes, how I became a writer, but also it was important to capture the social movements, the cultural atmosphere in which I became a writer. And I was really cognizant of the fact that if young people read this book, for example, the assassination of Martin Luther King, which is a pivotal event in my life, socially, politically, everything. I went in pretty much great detail about that. I wrote a lot about the emergence of Black women writers in the late 80s, the early 70s, and how writers like Toni Morrison, Ntozake Shange, et cetera, really redefined American culture through their books. And I was part of that because I inherited that legacy. So it's a memoir, and I'm very proud that it's a memoir, because memoirs have become now a wonderful form of literature. And but it's a memoir that ends up being a how-to book.
Right. So I apologize if everybody can hear my dog who has a lot to say. I want to jump to my question because it does have a very generous appendix with a lot of information. Uh, I didn't print that page, but in some respects, so um, the appendix contains a keynote address and a lot of resources to support other writers, which brings me to a couple of topics of where community fits in. Not, this is a craft question because I think community informs your writing and mentorships as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, community is very important to me. I think that I have a gene, a community gene in my body because I was an activist in college. And when I came back to Washington, D.C. from Boston in the 80s with Clyde McIlvaine, I formed the African American Writers Guild. Then we formed the Hurston Wright Foundation. And all throughout my life, I've always had community. It's been important to me to work with other writers. I mean, I have a group of women I hike with, a group of women I just get together with periodically. Then I have a group of women that I get together because we're writers. And I think that the job of writing is beautifully isolating in the sense that there's this wonderful sense for me that when I'm writing and I'm sitting alone, I'm performing an act that's very sacred and that is almost like prayer. But I need the community of other writers. They inspire me, they teach me, and the conversations we have are often really important in keeping up my spirit as well as it's just helping me figure out what it is I'm doing.
So, so what I hear you saying is, so in the book you talk about, you say, I used all the training and experience I had as a writer from poetry to fiction to journalism because each genre had in different ways informed me on how to write the book. So if I hear you correctly, you're saying it's not just your experience as a writer, but your experience as a human.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the other thing I say, the other part of that is that the the ways in which we talk about writing fiction, nonfiction, romance novel, science fiction, poetry, those, many of them are definitions that have been imposed on writing by the publishing industry to sell our product in their eyes more efficiently. And that doesn't really have much with what we want to do as writers. So the fact that I started as a poet and Nikki Giovanni published one of my poems in an anthology when I was in college, I tried to bring a poetic sensibility to the writing in that I wanted to write beautifully. And my beauty doesn't sound like other people's beauty, but it's my beauty. And journalism affected my writing because I learned how to research while I was at the J School at Columbia. I learned how not to be afraid of a blank page and to know that if I sat down, I could fill up that page. So that all the different types of writing that I'd done really had prepared me and given me the skills.
I'd like to follow that up with a specific question, a specific writer question, for people who write nonfiction, whether it's journalism or so interviews or creative nonfiction essays. You write about the challenge of inserting your voice, your own point of view, narrative. These are your words: narrative, meaning, and texture into interviews you wrote for Essence some years ago. Um, and especially during this time where journalism, keep my opinions out of it, where what journalism is doing, but where journalism has a role to not only report but to provide context. How does a writer, how do you as a writer provide a view of something that is not your experience but that you're sharing with us?
Well, I think the great myth about journalism is that it's objective. And of course it's not. Uh, one of the great one of the things that people don't know about newspapers, for example, and media, is that you cover the story that your editor wants you to find, not the reality that actually exists. So that journalists often complain that they're given a story, given an assignment, and if they come back with a story that is not reflective of what the editor wants, they're told to go back out and find that story. So the first, journalism is not objective. Secondly, everything is a story. And when I say everything's a story, I mean that everything is shaped. There's nothing that we read that hasn't been shaped by the fact that the writer, the editor, the publisher has chosen language, chosen emphasis, chosen how it's going to look on the page. So we're surrounded not by facts, but by stories. And that's why we read the newspaper, why we go online, why we go, everything that's viral. Everything is a story. And so I like, for example, to teach workshops where I'm working with people who are working in fiction and nonfiction, because I think that the memoirist needs to be able to create a world the way the novelist does. And the novelist needs to be able to write kind of with the confessional, revelatory sensibility that the memoirist does. So we're always creating stories. Everything's a story.
And you actually say in the book, lawyers are storytellers, and
Yes.
as a recovering lawyer, I have to agree. Um, I'm going to jump into the chat because there are a lot of questions. So I'm going to take them in the order that they appear. So we might jump around a little bit, but I think that'll be okay. So Caitlin wants to know, how do you get started writing? What are your writer habits?
Well, if I'm working on a project, I will usually write, I'll say, okay, I'm going to write 5 days a week, and I'll write for 1 hour. I'm a lark, so that my preferred time to write is in the morning. So I'll just simply set a time to do 1 hour. When I was younger and teaching in universities, I would have a teaching schedule, and I would usually have 2 days where I could really devote time to writing, and I'd write, 3, 4, 5 hours. But I find now that writing 1 hour of very focused writing, knowing what I want to write, is just as effective and just as productive as writing 3 or 4 hours.
So that's actually interesting because before I joined the Writers Center at 2018, I was writing on my own, and I sort of had this idea that to be a writer, you'd sit down and write for 8 hours, and no one does that.
Exactly. Especially
You're
women. Women do not have the time to do that. You know, the great writers, you know, like Tolstoy, one of my favorites. Well, he was a wealthy man, so he could do that. Um, women writers, especially with the responsibilities that they often have, can't do that. And I tell people, you know, God gave us 24 hours a day. And once you have decided, once you've really made that commitment to writing, you will find the hours that you need. You will know how to shape your life so that you can write. But as long as you're not really yet committed, you don't have time to write.
fair, I agree. Okay, Janet is asking, did the novel you started before the memoir eventually get written? If so, which one?
Well, no, it was, but parts of it and themes of it appeared in my first novel, A Woman's Place. So that novel was really good practice for what came after. And I've started a number of novels that did not get completed because they weren't mine to write ultimately. Um, and no words are wasted. You know, the process of writing is so fertile that no words are wasted. You've learned a lot, even when you've written something that you ultimately put aside.
So that brings me to a question I wanted to ask, which is I've heard a lot of writers say, um, I knew how to write book A, but book B taught me how to write book B. And you've written so many books. Do you think that that's a truism?
Oh yeah, I mean, you don't know what you're doing when you
I
when you
mean, but
start another. I mean, I don't know what
I,
I'm doing when I start another project. This book had no knowledge of the fact that I'd written 21 books before. And it gave me headaches. It gave me moments of pause. I'm a virgin every time I start a new project. And so, and that's actually at this point in my life, I find that's quite exciting. You write in order to find out what you're writing.
just turning the page on that paragraph. Um, Karen wants to know, how do you decide which elements, events of history to include in your writing?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you are writing about. Um, it depends on what your storyline is, what your plot is. Um, I mean, for example, my my second novel, Long Distance Life, is the story of a family in Washington, D.C. It covers 60 years in the life of this family. And the main character has migrated from the South to Washington, D.C., from down South to up South. And so I did an enormous amount of research. I spent hours in the Library of Congress, and the research can become this wonderful endeavor where you're just discovering all this information. It's just, you get actually hooked on researching. But I knew what I was looking for. I knew exactly what information would help me tell her story. So that of everything that I could, when I said research, my requests for them to bring me newspapers and magazines were, for example, who played at the Howard Theater in March of 1932? Um, what was on the corner of 14th and G Street in 1952? And those were the questions that I asked to create the world that she lived in. So that's how you decide what historical information you need. And that was, I
So,
remember, now that I'm talking about it, I remember that was so exciting. I mean, I remember going to the Washingtoniana section of the DC Public Library and seeing pictures of Washington, D.C. in 1940 or 1935 and looking at what was on the corner of a particular street when my fictional character would have walked on that street. Gave me chills.
Did what you find ever shift the direction of what you were writing?
Um, sometimes, sometimes it did.
Uh, Christopher wants to know, how did your writing go from sublime to peacefulness?
Well, I think that writing is a lot of things all at one time. Writing is nerve-wracking. It's mysterious. It's energizing. It's peaceful. It's frustrating. And if I feel that I've written a beautiful sentence or a sentence that I can turn into a beautiful sentence, I'm sublime.
Well, I mean, that's a perfect not shoehorn, perfect segue into the next question, which was, do you let anyone else read your writing as you're writing a novel other than an editor? But I'm gonna expand this to all your writing, as in other writers, your own personal focus group, or what I refer to as beta readers.
Oh, yes, definitely. My agent, if I'm working on say I'm working on a novel, I will usually send her the first, once I've got 100 pages, and she'll give me feedback. Also, I usually, when I'm working on a project, I will have one and possibly two really smart people who represent my target audience. And as I'm writing, ask them to read and be in dialogue with me. And I find that is very, very important because you can be so close to the topic, the subject, the characters, that you can miss important things. A number of years ago, I wrote a novel called After. And the idea of the novel, it was kind of inspired by the Prince Jones killing, which was the case that inspired Ta-Nehisi Coates to write his first book, where a young man was shot in the back by a police officer. And my own son had been the victim of police brutality. And I started by imagining a family. Here's a knock on the door one evening, and they open the door, and there are two policemen standing there, and they tell them that their son has been killed in a police incident. And what would happen to the family? What would be the events that would follow? And so as I wrote a number of drafts, and everyone who read the book said that the most interesting character in the book was not the mother or the father of the young man who had been killed, nor the young man himself, but the most interesting character was a police officer who had killed him. And I did not want to make a police officer the hero of my novel because I was prejudiced against police officers, and I just didn't want to do that. So I kept writing, and for 2 years, every time, this Marita, this belongs to the police officer. So finally, two things happened. One, I took a break from the novel because writing a novel, I'd never written a novel where a character had killed a person, was responsible for the death of someone. And I had to grow into the ability to do that once I really understood how deep and how transformative something like that is. So I took a year off and I wrote another book. I wrote a nonfiction book that was published. So when I came back to After, I was ready, one, to do that, and I was ready to give the novel to the police officer, because I was then ready to imagine him as a person, not a police officer, as a person who could feel guilt and shame because of what he had done. And it took me about 5 years to complete the whole book. And that's an example of growing into the person that the book needs you to be. And it was very important for my readers to tell me, Marita, you're wrong. You're wrong. This book belongs to the police officer. And they were exactly right, because a character who's been responsible for taking the life of another person is deeply complex. That's from a writer's point of view, that's a great character, because of all that that character has done and is suffering. But I was letting my prejudice against cops keep me from writing. And I ended up interviewing 12 cops for the book. And when they read it, they thanked me, because they said that I had captured their experience very well.
That just, dovetails back into when we were talking earlier about the experiences that we have and the community we're involved in and the support we get or don't get, informing the writing, which brings me to the next question, which is your book title mentions creating and honoring Black stories that matter. How do you determine which stories matter? How do you push past doubts of whether or not there's an audience or purpose for your story?
Well, I think that all stories are true, and I think all stories are valuable. I think that whether, you know, um, this is something that writers all, I mean, for example, when I was writing Migration of the Heart, one night I was in my apartment and I went to my bookshelf and I pulled down Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and I pulled down Langston Hughes' I Wonder as I Wander, hoping that those two memoirs would tell me how to write my book. And they couldn't, because I have to write my book. And one of the questions well, who's going to want to read this? Why would anyone read a story about my life? And yet there are only a couple of stories. We fall in love. We're born, we die. We're born, we leave home. We fall in love, it works. We fall in love, it fails. There are only about maybe 7 or 8 basic stories. And what will make your story powerful and read worthy is the consciousness of authenticity that you bring to it and the power of the language. Those are the two things that, and in fact, I teach a lot of memoir classes. I've always taught memoir, whether I was teaching at Johns Hopkins or Virginia Commonwealth University, and now I teach in the University of Marita Golden, and I teach a lot of memoir. And we're all came out of the same dysfunctional family. That's the thing I learned when I'm teaching memoir. We all think that the secrets in our family are the most terrible secrets ever. But no, they're the same secrets that were in my family.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons people enjoy reading memoirs, because it takes you into another world, but that world is real. That world is real. Like one of my favorite memoirs is a great memoir called All Over But the Shelton by Rick Bragg. Now he's probably now in his 70s, but he was formerly a writer for the New York Times. And he grew up, he called himself, growing up in Alabama as a white person, poor white trash. Okay. His mother picked cotton. His father was an alcoholic who was basically destroyed by going off to fight in Korea. This guy writes a book that when I'm reading this story of how he came up in Alabama, ended up going, leaving the South, becoming a big time professor, big time reporter, I couldn't put it down. And I couldn't put it down because even though my mother never picked cotton and my mother was Black, my mother had suffered disappointment. My mother had suffered hurt. And so what we do with our stories is we're reaching out to other people. We're reaching out to our readers. So I think it's very important for you to understand as writers that your stories are valuable. They are important. There's an audience, but you have to bring a consciousness of authenticity and vulnerability and strive to write with beauty. That's, why would anybody want to read? Because I made them want to. I made them want to read because once they read the first couple of lines, they couldn't stop. Somebody said we read him in freshman year in 2004. Okay, great. Yeah, yeah. And in fact, another book that he wrote, Rick Bragg, Bragg, is called Ava's Man. And it's a book about his grandfather, who was a moonshiner in the hills of Appalachia in the 1930s. And he never met his grandfather, but he interviewed everybody in his family. And he created such a vivid sense of this man that you felt like you knew him. And it didn't matter that I'm an African American woman who may have certain feelings about white people from Alabama. When I read that book, it didn't matter. We were one. And that's what literature does.
So let's jump into a couple of technical questions here. I'm going to throw a couple of questions at you, Marita. One is, how do you know when you have completed enough drafts? And then somebody further up in the question wants to know, are you an outliner? And basically, and the questions are really digging into their process of do you outline? Are you a seat of the pantser? What's your process for getting from A to B?
Well, yes, I'm an outliner. And I hold on to the outline in order to have the illusion that I know where I'm going and I know what I'm doing. And I know that the outline is going to change. If I write something on Monday, that may change the outline, but I am an outliner, particularly on a kind of a big project. How do you know when you're through? You just know. Writers often feel that they're finished way before they're finished. And you know how you know when you're finished? When there's nothing more to say. When you have been transformed, when you've been surprised and transformed by the project, you're through. It doesn't have to do with pages. It has to do who you are.
Yeah, I mean that resonates, and I guess that goes into having beta readers, other people reading it to you, reading it with you, saying, yeah, I know you think that's what you said, but you didn't say that to me.
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
Uh,
Yeah.
so
But you
there's
really
a
do have to be, if you haven't been transformed by the writing, you're not through. If you haven't, if the book that you have and you say this is finished is the same book that you started writing, you're not finished. Because books are supposed to surprise you. Books are supposed to take you places that you had not imagined. Books are supposed to take you where you actually don't want to go.
so I mean, I think that some people think about that as why they read, but you're talking about that as why you
Yeah,
write.
exactly. Exactly. The reader
Um,
cannot have that experience if the writer has not had that experience.
but that's actually really interesting to me because if you've outlined, that implies that you know where you're going to end
Of
up, but
course
you're
not.
saying,
An outline is an illusion.
okay, okay. Um, it's a question with a couple of supporting thumbs up. So I'm gonna, how do you determine the parameters of a quote memoir? What's the most important aspect of a pitch? And I'm not sure what they mean by a pitch, but I'm guessing a proposal.
So the first one was about memoir. Can you say that again?
How do you determine the parameters of
Oh,
a memoir?
oh, okay. Usually a memoir covers a slice of your life. It's not your whole life. My memoir covered my childhood up to leaving my marriage in Nigeria and coming back to the United States and beginning again. So it was a particular slice. Um, the memoir Educated, which, was a bestseller, covers her childhood, then
Yeah,
she
oh,
goes
yeah.
off and gets, quote, educated. So
Right.
that you're really looking at a dramatic arc of your life, a part of coming of age, coming into knowledge, coming into transformation. And what was the other one?
Something about a pitch. What constitutes a pitch? And I'm guessing that means a book proposal.
Well,
And Sean, if you want to jump, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
a pitch is a couple of sentences that entices anybody who hears it to want to know more. Um, a great pitch usually has the whole story in 2 or 3 sentences. It has conflict, it has crisis, and it has resolution in 3 or 4 sentences. What's the crisis? How'd you overcome it? Where are you now? What's a takeaway for the reader? I mean, like, for example, even though this is a book, the memoir of a writer, I like to say this is a book about a little girl who grew up and all of her dreams came true. So that even if you're not a writer, it's a great story.
Um, so Brittany says, did you struggle with recalling memories slash identifying your truth? And I just want to share just personally, I overheard a conversation on Saturday with somebody insisting that memoir is fiction.
It is. Some of it is. Some of it is. Certainly, there are times when you will fictionalize because you can't possibly remember everything. And you fictionalize based on your, this is the way you're supposed to fictionalize, based on your honest memories of what happened and your honest memories of the people involved so that you're not taking revenge. You're not working out your issues. You're telling a story. So yes, you use fictional techniques like scene setting and dialogue. And yes, you will sometimes fictionalize in service of the story, but that doesn't mean that the story is not true. The emotional truth of your story can be honored even when you change a name or change where something happened.
Sorry, I'm taking notes. Um, um, so I think there were several questions about this, and then Gabrielle, I'll get to yours in a moment. Several questions about how you navigate, how do you decide when you're writing a memoir, where the line is, what do you include about other people who are
But
part
you
of your
include,
story?
yeah, you include what's really important. And sometimes that will be something that's difficult. And you can just write and be damned. Um, or you can talk to the person that you're writing about, try to engage them, try to assure them uh, that you're not trying to reveal family secrets or get back at them. But in the final analysis, you have the right to tell your own story. You have the right to tell your own story. And I think it's important to write with compassion, about people in your family who cause you pain or difficulty. you want to make them dimensional. You want to make them dimensional. And if you make the people around you dimensional, they're not just bad guys. They're really interesting. And people in family may still be mad, but that's their problem.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things sometimes if I have a challenging experience in my day with a stranger, I always wonder what the stranger's narrative about the same experience is.
Mhm, mhm.
Um,
Yeah, my
so
favorite
yeah,
book about memoir, well, my two Bibles are The Art of Slow Writing by Louise DeSalvo. And it's a wonderful book about writing and why writing is supposed to be slow. And it's just a beautiful little short chapters about how writing is this really important, special, sacred thing, and we need to stop trying to rush it. And then the best book that I've read about memoir writing is The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr, Karr.
um, there was a question, I think it's farther up in the chat. Can you talk about the publishing industry for Black writers now? Can you speak on some of the current publishing world, especially for Black writers? Is the question.
Well, I mean, I have a real sort of between love-hate relationship with the publishing industry because on the one hand, I had so many really fine editors who worked with me on my books, who supported my books, who tried to get me contracts. Many times they did. And yet the publishing industry has a long way to go in terms of being an industry that really empowers African Americans to be in positions of authority. The current landscape, I think despite having said that, it's probably better, certainly than it's ever been, in that you have the big five publishers, you have many, many small presses, and you have the option to self-publish. So that I think that I tell anybody, this is as good a time as any and a better time than most to be an African American writer. Yes, there are disparities. White writers get higher advances, um, often get better promotion, but that's not something to stop you from writing. And that's something that you don't need to worry about. So I say this is as good a time as any to be a Black writer, better than any time before. And I think that in terms of finding community, there's so many places like the Hurston Wright Foundation, Voices of Our Nation, Kimbilio, Quayle. If you Google support for Black writers, oh my God, everything will come up. So that there's never been a better time when Black writers could get emotional support for their endeavors. And even though I wish that there were more Black people in the publishing industry in positions of authority, there are more Black editors than there have been in a while.
And also, if you buy the book, Marita's book, there's a tremendous appendix of resources and residencies and fellowships and lots of support for writers, for Black writers. Um, we're running out of time soon. So I want to get to a couple of my favorite questions. Is there anything that no one has asked you about your writing that you'd like to talk about?
um, yeah, well, I don't know that no one's ever asked me, but I would like to just say that writing is a very joyful endeavor. We talk a lot about the stress, the strain, the struggle, how many drafts did you write? How long did it take you to write? But I just feel that just writing is a beautiful, very important act to perform, whether you're writing in a diary or whether you're writing something for publication, because you are attempting to give something to the world, whether that world is your individual world or the larger world. I find writing very joyful. And that's something that we rarely talk about.
I guess my final question is going to be, if you could give one piece of advice to writers just starting out, what would that be?
To write and to write. I
Sorry, that's
think
the best answer I've ever heard.
people will say, "Oh, I have a million ideas. I have so many ideas. I don't know which one to write." And a lot of times people will have a million ideas so that they don't write. So if you have a million ideas, you don't have to choose one, but you have to choose. If you want to write, you really do have to choose. And I tell people to choose, always choose the story that scares you the most, because that's a story that you need, and it's a story the world needs.
So how do you get past that fear?
One step at a time, one step at a time, by being in community with other writers, by reading other writers, by going to writers' events, and by writing. By committing something to paper and working. It's a job, but it's a joyful job.
Well, I want to thank you deeply for bringing this conversation to the Writer Center. I've really
Sure.
enjoyed it. I hope everybody else had. Please go to your independent bookseller, buy a copy of the book, write
And
positive,
if
glowing
people,
reviews.
yeah, and if people want to get on my mailing list, they can simply go
Yeah.
to my website and there'll be a pop-up where they can join the mailing list. If they want to reach out to me personally, they can send me an email at maritagolden.com. And I do workshops and all during the year. And as I say, teach at the University of Marita Golden.
Uh, Thank you for your generosity, and good night, everybody.
This was fun. Thank you. Thank you, Amy.